The sea burned that night. Flames rolled over black waves as the freighter Eagle Star split apart in the North Atlantic, her steel hull shrieking like a wounded animal. The air was thick with oil and smoke, sailors clung to floating debris while tracer fire stitched across the horizon. Somewhere in the chaos, a voice shouted for help, another for God. Then only the hiss of the ocean swallowing fire. Lieutenant Warren Hayes clung to a life raft, eyes fixed on the sinking silhouette. He had seen ships go down before, but never this fast, never this final. The convoy had left Halifax 5 days earlier, 30 Liberty ships hauling food, tanks, and medicine to Britain. Now, half were gone. U-boats stalked them like wolves, invisible and patient. Each explosion in the distance meant another 100 souls lost, another ship that had taken 230 days to build, and less than 10 minutes to die. By dawn, the survivors were silent, shivering under the gray light. Hayes whispered to the sailor beside him, "They can't build them fast enough." The sailor gave a hollow laugh. "They can't even bury us fast enough." Thousands of miles away, in Washington, D.C., the same words echoed through a smoke-filled war room. Maps covered the walls, red pins marking sunken ships across the Atlantic. President Roosevelt's naval advisors spoke in clipped voices, the weight of defeat pressing down on every syllable. "We're losing 5 ships for every one we build," said Admiral Land, his hand trembling over the figures. "Germany is cutting our supply lines faster than we can weld replacements." Roosevelt leaned back in his chair, silent. The war machine of democracy was running out of breath. America could not fight without steel, food, or fuel crossing the ocean. Every soldier overseas depended on those ships, the Liberty Fleet, and the factories that made them. That was when someone mentioned a name, Henry John Kaiser. He was no admiral, no shipwright, not even a trained engineer. He was a builder of highways, a dam maker, a man whose hands had shaped mountains. In the world of steel and rivets, he was an outsider. Yet his name came with an echo of impossible achievements, the Hoover Dam, the Grand Coulee, projects finished in half the expected time. To the desperate men in Washington, he represented something they had almost forgotten: speed. When they summoned him to the Capitol, Kaiser arrived without fanfare. Stocky, round-faced, eyes sharp behind rimmed glasses, he looked more like a grocer than a revolutionary. The Naval Committee greeted him with skepticism. "Mr. Kaiser," Admiral Land began, "you've never built a ship. Not even a rowboat." Kaiser smiled mildly. "I've built dams taller than battleships and roads across deserts. The principles are the same: organization, efficiency, and belief that time is the enemy." The admirals exchanged glances. Kaiser unfolded a set of hand-drawn sketches from his briefcase: shipyards sprawling along the California coast, cranes, conveyor belts, prefabrication lines. It looked less like a dock and more like an automobile plant. "You plan to build ships like Ford's," one officer said dryly. "Exactly," Kaiser replied. "Mass production. Standardized parts. Welded, not riveted. Multiple sections built at once and assembled like toys? Like miracles," Kaiser said quietly. They laughed. But Roosevelt did not. The president leaned forward, intrigued. "How long would it take you to build one of these Liberty ships?" Kaiser hesitated only a second. "Less than half the current time." The room fell silent. Roosevelt's eyes narrowed. "You have your chance, Mr. Kaiser. Prove it." Within weeks, Henry Kaiser was standing on a barren stretch of Richmond, California coastline, staring at mud and fog. Around him, engineers argued, foremen shouted, and the wind whipped through skeletons of cranes still unassembled. He pulled his coat tighter and turned to his assistant. "Start bringing in workers," he said. "Everyone we can get. Men, women, it doesn't matter if they've never held a hammer. We'll teach them." The assistant blinked. "But, sir, there's no housing, no roads." Then we'll build those too. Word spread fast. Across California, down from Oregon, and even out of the Dust Bowl states, thousands arrived at Richmond. Men with calloused hands and broken dreams, women who had never worked outside their homes. They came for a paycheck, some for patriotism, others simply because there was nothing left where they'd been. Evelyn Carter was one of them. 23, soft-spoken, newly widowed. Her husband's ship had gone down off Greenland 6 months ago. She arrived with a small suitcase and his photograph folded in her pocket. When she stepped into the shipyard for the first time, the noise was deafening, steam hissing, metal clanging, voices shouting across the docks. A foreman barked orders. "You're welders now. No experience? Fine, you'll learn. You've got 40 days to build a ship that takes the Navy 230. The women laughed nervously. Evelyn didn't. She raised her welding mask, eyes fixed on the enormous frame of steel rising out of the mud. "I'll build it faster," she whispered. The first weeks were chaos. Machines failed, parts went missing, blueprints were misread. The air was thick with dust and sweat. Workers collapsed from exhaustion, some quit after a single shift. Kaiser walked the yards at night, coat flapping in the wind, taking notes in a small leather notebook. He watched welders spark steel under floodlights and saw the rhythm in the madness. One evening, he stopped beside a group of tired workers eating from tin lunchboxes. "You think this is impossible," he said gently. A man spat in the dirt. "I think you're crazy, sir." Kaiser smiled. "Good. Every miracle starts that way." By the end of the month, the first hull was ready for assembly. Reporters gathered, cameras flashing, eager to see the experiment fail. The ship looked more like an unfinished skeleton than a vessel of war. Cranes groaned, welders cursed, and inspectors shouted over the noise. A storm rolled in from the Pacific, rain hammering steel and drowning orders. Evelyn worked through it, sparks flying from her torch like fireflies. When dawn broke, the ship still stood. Bent, imperfect, but standing. Roosevelt's liaison visited the yard, unimpressed. "You're behind schedule," he said coldly. Kaiser didn't flinch. "Behind now means ahead later. Every mistake we fix today saves 100 tomorrow." He spent nights studying every delay, why the cranes jammed, why the welders wasted minutes moving between stations. He brought in engineers from automobile plants, organized shifts around the clock, and introduced conveyor systems to deliver parts directly to crews. The shipyard began to change shape, evolving into something between a factory and a living organism. Soon, the workers felt it too. The chaos began to hum with rhythm. Men moved in sync, welders timed their torch burns to the beat of the hammering. The sound of progress was deafening, exhilarating, relentless. Evelyn found herself leading a small team of welders, her hands steady, her eyes fierce beneath the mask. She stopped thinking about her husband's death only when she worked. The heat, the noise, it drowned the grief. Sometimes, late at night, she'd trace his name on a steel plate before welding it into the hull, a secret tribute buried beneath armor. One evening, as Kaiser reviewed the progress, a storm of sparks rained down beside him. He turned to see Evelyn's team finishing a critical joint under flickering lights. "You've done fine work," he said, his voice almost lost in the din. Evelyn lifted her mask. "We just want it to float." He smiled faintly. "It will do more than float." Days bled into nights, and the first Liberty ship, SS Jeremiah O'Brien, inched closer to completion. 230 days was the old record. Kaiser was determined to do it in 90. But just as hope peaked, disaster struck. A faulty weld cracked during testing, splitting a section of the hull. Panic rippled across the yard. The Navy inspectors ordered work halted until repairs were complete. Reporters seized on the failure, calling Kaiser's project the folly of speed. Kaiser refused to stop. He gathered his top engineers in a makeshift office and slammed his notebook onto the table. We'll switch to continuous welding. No rivets. Stronger, faster. One man protested, that's never been done on this scale. Then we'll be the first, Kaiser replied. They worked through the night, testing techniques, refining alloys, pushing boundaries no shipbuilder had dared before. By morning, the hull was sealed again, stronger than before. When the inspectors returned, Kaiser handed them a clipboard. Test it, he said. You'll find it holds. It did. From that day forward, the rhythm of the shipyard changed. Each failure became a lesson, each delay a problem to outsmart. Workers began to believe in the impossible schedule. They built faster, worked smarter. Every clang of metal felt like a heartbeat against the war's ticking clock. Weeks later, as the first Liberty ship rolled down the ways and touched the Pacific, the workers erupted into cheers. Whistles blew, flags waved, cameras flashed. Evelyn stood among them, tears streaking her soot-stained cheeks. The ship glided into the water, awkward, plain, but alive. Henry Kaiser watched from the pier, his hat in his hand. Around him, men and women shouted his name, but his gaze remained on the horizon. Beyond it lay the Atlantic, still red with fire, still hungry. He turned to his assistant. It took 95 days, he said softly. Better than 230, but not enough. The assistant frowned. Not enough, sir. Kaiser's jaw tightened. Every extra day costs lives. We'll cut it in half again. As the sun set over Richmond, the shipyard's floodlights came alive, washing the steel frames in silver and gold. Sparks flew like stars, workers moved in waves, and the sound of hammering rolled across the bay like thunder. Somewhere far away, another ship sank beneath cold waves. But here, something had begun. Kaiser looked at the glowing skeletons of new ships rising from the mud and whispered to himself, "We'll build faster. Faster than war can destroy." The wind carried the words through the clang and roar, through the endless chorus of steel. For a moment, even the ocean seemed to listen. And as the night deepened, the rhythm of hammers quickened again, an industrial heartbeat racing against time, against loss, against the sea itself. The war had outrun the builders. But now, at last, one builder was starting to catch up. The shipyard did not sleep anymore. It breathed. It pulsed. It groaned like a living thing made of iron and sweat. By dawn, steam hissed from pipes that twisted along the skeletal forms of ships. By night, the floodlights painted the fog white, turning the yard into something between heaven and hell, a place where creation and destruction met halfway. The newspapers had begun to call it the factory that floated. The name sounded grand, almost holy, but for those inside its gates, it was less miracle than madness. Henry Kaiser stood at the edge of Dock 3, coat collar turned up against the biting wind. He stared at the half-finished hull that towered before him, a wall of steel ribs and rivets so tall it swallowed the sky. The sound of hammering rolled over the yard in steady rhythm, metal against metal, time against time. The war was devouring ships faster than the Navy could name them, and every delay meant another convoy sunk, another grave in the Atlantic. Kaiser's engineers had said it couldn't be done. Ships of this size, this complexity, couldn't be built faster than 7 months, even under perfect conditions. But Kaiser wasn't interested in perfect conditions. He wanted speed, unrelenting, unimaginable speed. His mind had always worked that way: take the impossible, break it apart, and build it again until it obeyed. He turned to his foreman, a burly man named Donovan. "We need another hull launched by the end of the week," Kaiser said. Donovan hesitated. "Sir, the steel from Bethlehem plant hasn't arrived yet. We're already patching panels with leftovers from the last batch." Kaiser's eyes didn't blink. "Then use the leftovers. Cut them differently. Weld them faster. Improvise." Donovan's jaw tightened. You can't improvise with ships, sir. Not when men's lives depend on them floating. Kaiser's reply came like a hammer strike. And they depend on us building them before they drown. The argument ended there. Below the scaffolding, Evelyn Carter pulled her welding mask down and struck an arc. The blue flame roared to life, showering the deck with sparks. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, measured, steady, unbroken. Around her, hundreds of workers formed a human storm, riveters hammering at gunnels, electricians threading copper lines, mechanics shouting over the din. The air smelled of oil, hot metal, and exhaustion. Evelyn was one of the first women hired when Kaiser opened the Richmond yards, and by now, she was one of its best welders. They called her Torch, half out of respect, half out of superstition. It was said that wherever Torch worked, steel never cracked. She didn't believe in myths, but she believed in the work. The welds she laid down weren't just seams of molten metal, they were lifelines stretching across the ocean, binding together the fate of soldiers she'd never meet. When her shift ended, she didn't go home. Most nights she stayed to teach new recruits, young women from Iowa, Tennessee, Kansas, faces pale with fear and wonder as they touched a torch for the first time. She told them not to flinch from the heat. The flame only hurts if you don't respect it, she'd say. You respect it, it respects you. But there was a cost to respect. Her hands were calloused, her lungs raw from fumes. Sometimes, when she finally stumbled into her rented room near the bay, she dreamed of metal bending like skin, of ships whispering her name as they slid into the water. The scale of Kaiser's ambition grew monstrous by the day. Prefabrication had changed everything. Instead of building one ship from the ground up, he divided the process into fragments, sections constructed simultaneously in different shops, then welded together like pieces of a giant puzzle. It was revolutionary, efficient, and terrifyingly fast. The first time it worked flawlessly, Kaiser didn't cheer. He just stood there, watching the sections align like clockwork, and whispered, "Now we can win." But speed demanded sacrifice. Accidents became more frequent as deadlines shrank. One December morning, a cable snapped while hoisting a deckhouse, and 1,000 tons of steel came crashing down. The explosion of sound ripped through the yard. Workers scattered. Evelyn was among the first to reach the wreckage. She found 2 men pinned beneath the collapsed girder, blood pooling beneath them, steam rising from their torn uniforms. She tried to help lift it, but the weight was immovable, like the war itself pressing down. The medics arrived too late. That night, Kaiser visited the site himself. He stood in silence as they cleared the debris. A young worker, eyes wide with rage, shouted at him, "They died for your schedule." Kaiser didn't respond. He didn't sleep that night either. In the morning, he ordered double pay for anyone on double shifts and installed new safety protocols. But deep down, he knew no rulebook could make this easier. They were waging war on time, and time fought back cruelly. The government sent inspectors to Richmond to study Kaiser's miracle method. Generals, senators, and journalists flooded the yards, marveling at the spectacle. Headlines proclaimed, "Liberty ships, the arsenal that floats." But the visitors didn't see the exhaustion etched into the faces behind the sparks. They didn't hear the coughs from inhaling metal dust or the quiet prayers whispered before every launch. Evelyn's roommate, Nora, had been one of those who prayed. She was small, quick, and laughed easily, until the day the sparks caught her coveralls. The fire spread too fast. Evelyn remembered the scream more vividly than the flames. The foreman put it down as an industrial accident. Evelyn called it something else, the cost of miracles. By spring, the shipyard had transformed into something almost mythic. Dozens of Liberty ships floated along the docks, ready for war. Each one bore a name that carried meaning: hope, freedom, valiant, eternal. Evelyn's favorite was the Republic Star, a ship she had welded from keel to bridge. When it launched, she felt as though she'd released a piece of her soul into the sea. Kaiser's fame spread across the country. Photographers followed him through the yards. Magazines called him the man who outran war. He posed for photos with workers, shaking hands, smiling his hard, determined smile. But when the cameras stopped flashing, the mask slipped. Evelyn saw it once, just once, when she handed him a list of equipment shortages. His eyes were bloodshot, the corners lined with fatigue. "Mr. Kaiser," she said quietly, "you can't build faster than people can live." He looked at her for a long moment before replying. "No," he said. "But I can try to make living mean something." That night, rain swept across Richmond. The floodlights shimmered in puddles, reflecting the silhouettes of cranes and half-finished ships. Evelyn worked through the storm, welding inside the hull of a vessel named the Independence. The thunder outside mingled with the crackle of her torch. It felt as though the world was collapsing and rebuilding itself at once. Then the power went out. The yard plunged into darkness, punctuated only by flashes of lightning. For a few moments, there was silence, then shouting. Somewhere down the line, an electrical fire had erupted. Evelyn grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the flames. Workers formed a chain, passing buckets of water, shouting over the roar. The blaze caught along the scaffolding, feeding on oil and paint. Evelyn climbed to the second deck, searching for trapped workers. She found a boy, 17, maybe, frozen by fear, his leg caught under debris. She tore her gloves on the hot metal trying to free him. When she finally dragged him clear, the structure groaned and gave way behind them. They tumbled onto the wet deck as firefighters swarmed the scene. The boy coughed violently, eyes wide. Evelyn's hands shook uncontrollably. The next morning, Kaiser visited the site again. The fire had destroyed a week's worth of work. No one died, but dozens were injured. Reporters wanted statements, the Navy wanted results. Kaiser dismissed them all and spent the day walking the blackened yard in silence. That evening, he gathered the foremen and workers under the massive crane. "I asked too much," he began. His voice carried through the cold air. "But I'll ask again. Because what we're doing here, it's not just building ships. It's building hope. Every plate of steel we weld is a promise that tyranny won't outlast courage. You are not workers, you're soldiers. And this," he gestured toward the glowing horizon, "this is our battlefield." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was honest. They went back to work that night with renewed fire. By midsummer, the Richmond yards had broken their own record, a ship every 5 days. The Navy was stunned. Britain's supply lines were healing. The impossible had become routine. Yet success carried a strange emptiness. The faster they built, the less they felt. Each launch blurred into the next. Evelyn began to lose track of which ships were hers. They all looked the same, gray hulls, white numbers, red keels sliding into dark water. Sometimes she wondered if they even floated, or if they simply vanished into the mist, like ghosts bound for a war that would never end. Then came the order that would define everything: build a Liberty ship in 4 days. The announcement struck like lightning. Some laughed, others swore. But Kaiser wasn't joking. "We've proven 5 days is possible," he told his managers. "Now we'll prove what's beyond possible." The plan was madness, a round-the-clock operation with rotating crews, no downtime, no excuses. Kaiser called it the Peary Project, named after the Arctic explorer who refused to stop moving north. Evelyn's crew volunteered immediately. "If we can build in 4 days," she said, "we can build for victory." The first dawn of the operation was unlike anything Richmond had seen. The entire yard was awake, hundreds of workers, engineers, and supervisors swarming like ants over steel. The floodlights never went off. Whistles marked the passing of shifts, and Kaiser himself stood by the docks with a stopwatch. Day 1, the keel was laid. Day 2, the hull rose like a cathedral. Day 3, the decks took shape, engines roared, cranes screamed. By day 4, it was real, a ship of steel and courage, born in less time than most men needed to recover from a fever. When the Robert E. Peary slid into the water, the cheers were deafening. Even the workers who had doubted wept openly. Evelyn stood near the bow, her hands trembling, her face illuminated by the reflection of the ship she helped bring to life. For the first time in years, she felt something close to awe. Kaiser turned to his team, voice hoarse but steady. "If we can do this once," he said, "we can do it again." He didn't know it yet, but the miracle of speed had a shadow, and that shadow was waiting in the days to come. And as the Peary vanished into the horizon, Evelyn whispered to herself, "We built her too fast. I just hope she remembers how to float." The wind carried her words out to sea, where the ship's engines roared against the tide, a floating factory, a symbol of human will, and the beginning of a legacy no one yet understood. The morning after the Robert E. Peary launched, the Richmond shipyard was eerily quiet. The echoes of cheering had faded, replaced by the distant cries of gulls and the groan of cranes idle for the first time in weeks. The ship had already reached open water, cutting through the Pacific on her maiden voyage toward Panama. Newspapers across the country hailed it as the miracle at Richmond. To the public, it was triumph. To those who built her, it was exhaustion draped in glory. Evelyn Carter sat on a stack of steel beams near Dock 4, her gloves resting beside her. The skin on her hands had split from the heat, the cuts burned when she flexed her fingers. She stared at the water, its surface littered with bits of slag and ash. The air smelled faintly of smoke from the torches that had burned for 4 straight days without pause. Her body ached, her vision blurred from sleeplessness. Yet her mind wouldn't rest. She kept replaying those last moments, the whistle of the launch, the wave of cheers, the shimmering reflection of the Peary sliding into the bay. Something about it had felt too perfect. Unreal. Henry Kaiser's office sat above the docks, a small island of glass and concrete in a sea of iron. From his window, he could see the remnants of the great operation, the charred cranes, the blackened cables, the wrecked generators that had burned out under the relentless strain. His engineers were already repairing them, but he could see their shoulders slumped, their steps slower than usual. He should have been proud. The Peary had broken every record in shipbuilding history. It had proven his dream possible. But the victory left a bitter taste. He'd seen the medical reports. Dozens injured from exhaustion, a handful hospitalized with burns and chemical pneumonia. 2 had collapsed during the final night. 1 never woke up. No newspaper mentioned their names. The price of speed, he thought grimly, was measured not in dollars but in lives. Later that day, a delegation from Washington arrived, suits, photographers, admirals, all eager to shake his hand and call him a genius. "You've outdone yourself, Henry," said a congressman, grinning for the camera. "You've proven what American industry can achieve when pushed to the edge." Kaiser managed a faint smile. "The edge is a dangerous place to build from," he said quietly. No one heard him over the clicking of cameras. That night, the workers gathered in the mess hall for a rare celebration. Music played from a scratchy radio, and someone passed around bottles of cheap bourbon. Laughter filled the air, but it was hollow, the laughter of people trying to forget how close they'd come to breaking. Evelyn sat beside her foreman, Jack Morgan, who nursed a cigarette and stared at the floor. "They'll call this a miracle," he muttered. But it wasn't a miracle. It was blood, smoke, and no sleep. Evelyn nodded. "Miracles don't blister your hands." Jack looked at her. "You think it was worth it?" She hesitated. "I think someone out there will live because of that ship. That's worth something." He exhaled slowly, smoke curling from his lips. "Yeah. But who's gonna save us?" His words lingered like a challenge. As weeks passed, the Peary's success rippled through the Allied command. More orders flooded in. Washington demanded that all yards follow Kaiser's Richmond method. Other industrialists tried to replicate it, cutting assembly times, pushing their workers to mirror the pace that had stunned the world. But no one could quite match it. Richmond was different. It had become more than a shipyard, it was a symbol, a myth in motion. Kaiser expanded operations again, constructing new fabrication halls and hiring thousands more workers. Many were women, African Americans, immigrants, people who had been told all their lives that they had no place in heavy industry. Now, they became the backbone of the war machine. The factory floor turned into a chorus of accents and dialects, hammers and torches joining their rhythm into something almost sacred. Still, beneath the music of progress, something darker grew. The pace was unrelenting. Sleep was rare. Accidents returned. Evelyn noticed the change in the air first. The new workers came in smiling and left coughing. The fumes from the welders hung thicker than before, the masks were in short supply. When she complained to the foreman, he nodded, said he'd pass it up the chain. Nothing happened. Kaiser himself barely left his office anymore. He spent nights staring at blueprints, recalculating assembly sequences, chasing the illusion of perfection. The pressure from Washington had become suffocating. The Navy wanted another Peary every week. The press called him the man who could beat time. The president himself had written a note of personal thanks. Yet the more praise he received, the more hollow it felt. One evening, Evelyn was called to demonstrate new welding techniques for visiting officials. She stood before them in her grease-stained coveralls while they watched from a safe distance, their suits untouched by soot. When she struck her torch, one man clapped. "Remarkable," he said. "To think, a woman doing the work of a dozen men." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I'm not doing the work of men," she said, eyes hidden by her mask. "I'm doing the work of war." That night, a storm swept in from the Pacific. The wind howled across the bay, bending the cranes and snapping loose tarps from unfinished hulls. The workers tried to keep going, but the rain turned the yard into a mire. Sparks hissed out as torches sputtered in the downpour. Evelyn and her crew took shelter under a half-built deck, watching the lightning flash over the water. Then, without warning, an explosion tore through Dock 7. A fuel line had burst, ignited by a stray spark from a generator. The blast threw a wave of fire into the night sky. Workers screamed. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the flames, her boots slipping in the mud. The rain turned to steam as it hit the inferno. She could see silhouettes, men trapped under twisted metal. By the time the fire crews arrived, she and Jack had already pulled 3 survivors out. Their faces were blackened with soot, eyes wide with shock. The storm swallowed the sound of their coughing. When the blaze finally died, the damage was catastrophic, one entire section of the ship destroyed, 15 workers injured, 2 dead. The next morning, Kaiser stood in the wreckage, rain dripping from his hat. His engineers surrounded him, arguing over causes, faulty wiring, negligence, sabotage. He said nothing. Evelyn, watching from a distance, saw something shift in his face. Not anger. Not grief. Something quieter. Something like reckoning. He called an emergency meeting in the yard that afternoon. Workers gathered under the gray sky, listening as he spoke through a crackling loudspeaker. "I know you're tired," he began. "I know every one of you has given more than anyone should have to give. You've worked through storms, through fire, through loss. And yet, here you stand. Every ship we build carries the strength of your hands across the ocean. I won't lie to you, there's no easy way to win this war. But there is a right way. We'll slow down just enough to stay human." There was silence, then a ripple of applause. It wasn't loud, but it was real. True to his word, Kaiser revised the schedules. Production continued, but with longer breaks, better equipment, improved ventilation. He hired doctors and nurses for a proper clinic in the yard and established on-site childcare for women with families. For the first time, Richmond began to feel less like a factory and more like a community, a strange, battered, hopeful city built on the promise of endurance. Evelyn saw the change too. Her crew was smaller now, some had left, others had been lost, but the ones who remained worked with steadier hands. The welds were cleaner, the ships sturdier. They began to take pride not just in how fast they could build, but in how well. One afternoon, Kaiser came down to the docks himself. He walked without his usual entourage, just a clipboard in one hand. Evelyn spotted him inspecting the Liberty Belle II, a ship she'd helped design improvements for. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes had softened. "You kept her straight," he said quietly. Evelyn smiled faintly. "She'll hold." He nodded. "You've done more for this yard than anyone knows." She looked at the water shimmering behind him. "It's not the yard that matters," she said. "It's what we send out there. Every ship carries pieces of us. And some of us don't come back." Kaiser's gaze followed hers. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine what lay beyond the horizon, the convoys, the storms, the submarines lurking below. The ships they built weren't just machines. They were lifelines stretched across chaos. The miracle at Richmond wasn't a single event anymore. It was a state of being, a defiance that lived in every welder, every riveter, every soul who refused to yield. Months later, the Peary returned from its Atlantic run, battered but intact. The news reached the yard like a spark through dry tinder. Crews cheered, wept, clapped one another on the back. Evelyn stood by the radio, listening to the report. The ship had delivered vital supplies to Britain and escorted survivors from a torpedoed convoy. Against every odd, she had survived. That night, Kaiser held no press conference, no ceremony. He simply walked out onto the pier and stared into the darkness where the sea met the sky. Evelyn joined him. They stood together in silence, the wind carrying the scent of salt and steel. "Do you think it'll ever be enough?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally. "But maybe it doesn't have to be. Maybe enough is just what we can give before we're gone." A distant foghorn moaned across the bay. The reflection of cranes and floodlights shimmered like ghosts. Evelyn looked out over the water and thought of all the ships still sailing, the ones yet to be built, the ones already lost. Each one carried a story, a memory welded into its hull. The war was far from over. But for the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. Not because they had won, but because they had endured. And as dawn broke over Richmond, the shipyard awoke again, not to chase speed, but to honor what speed had cost. The workers returned to their stations, slower but stronger, their footsteps echoing through the fog. The miracle wasn't the ship they built in 4 days. It was the people who had built it, and the spirit that refused to sink. The sea was calm the morning the Robert E. Peary returned home, gliding through the mist like a phantom born of steel and sweat. Her hull bore the scars of the Atlantic, jagged marks from storms and shrapnel, but she sailed proudly, her decks lined with sailors who owed their lives to the men and women of Richmond. On the dock, Henry Kaiser stood waiting. The crowd cheered as the ship eased in, her whistle bellowing a sound that seemed to shake the sky. For days, that was all it had taken to build her. 96 hours that had rewritten the laws of industry and defied the rhythm of war itself. Yet for all the applause and newspaper flashbulbs, Kaiser's eyes were fixed on the workers standing silently behind the fences, faces gray from exhaustion. Their triumph was carved into their bodies, bandaged hands, oil-stained uniforms, sunken eyes that hadn't seen sleep in days. To the world, they were heroes. To themselves, they were survivors. Evelyn Carter was among them, her welding gloves still dangling from her belt. She felt no thrill as the officials praised the miracle of American industry. What she felt was a hollow ache behind her ribs, a fatigue that reached deeper than her bones. 4 days of constant welding, 4 days of noise, flame, and metal so hot it glowed white. The Piri had been built faster than any ship in history, but the cost had been invisible to those cheering in the grandstands. Evelyn's friend, Clara, had collapsed on the 3rd night and never woken up. No one spoke of her during the celebration. Kaiser's speech was brief. He thanked the workers, the navy, the nation. His voice trembled slightly when he said, "This ship is proof that no obstacle, no limitation, can stop the will of free people united in purpose." The words drew thunderous applause. Cameras flashed. But as he stepped away from the podium, the sound faded in his ears, replaced by the faint echo of hammer strikes that had filled the nights leading up to this moment. He wondered how many more miracles his people could endure before they broke. By autumn, the yards were at full tilt again. The Piri had set a record, but there was no time to bask in victory. Orders for new Liberty ships arrived daily, dozens at a time. Kaiser's empire had expanded into multiple yards across the west coast, each operating day and night under floodlights. It was a kingdom of motion, an industrial storm that refused to slow. Evelyn now supervised a crew of 200. Her hands were scarred, her hair singed in places, her hearing half gone from the roar of machinery. But she kept going. She told herself that every ship she built meant another convoy that might make it through the U-boat gauntlet. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she imagined those ships as angels made of steel, crossing dark waters to carry hope where none remained. Still, the weight of what they'd built lingered. The Piri had proven what was possible, but it also set a standard no human could sustain forever. Rumors began spreading that Washington wanted even faster production, even shorter deadlines. Some workers whispered that Kaiser's miracle had become a curse. "They think we can bend time," one foreman grumbled. But time bends people, not the other way around. Inside his office overlooking the docks, Kaiser felt the pressure mounting. He had become a symbol of American determination, the man who could conjure ships from nothing but willpower. Every senator, every admiral wanted to shake his hand. Yet in private, he confided to his son Edgar, "I've built an army without guns. But armies need rest. If they burn out, we lose everything." Edgar looked at him carefully. "Then slow it down." Kaiser shook his head. "Can't. Not yet. The war's still swallowing men faster than we can save them." The words hung between them like smoke. Winter came hard that year. Rain turned the yards into swamps of mud and oil. Floodlights glowed through the mist as workers trudged to their stations, their breath rising in ghostly clouds. Every clang of metal was a heartbeat. Every ship launched was a small defiance against the darkness swallowing Europe. Evelyn found herself working beside newcomers barely old enough to vote. Some couldn't even lift a welding torch properly. But they learned fast, because they had to. The war didn't wait for anyone to grow up. One night, after a 14-hour shift, Evelyn stood by the bay, watching sparks float across the water like stars. Her reflection shimmered on the surface, soot-streaked face, eyes red from smoke. She thought about Clara again, and the hundreds who'd been injured, the few who hadn't returned after their shifts. The papers called them America's industrial soldiers. But no one pinned medals on their chests. No one sent their mothers telegrams. A voice startled her. "You ever think it's all too much?" She turned. It was Jack Morgan, one of the foremen, a man with grease permanently etched into the lines of his hands. "All the time," she said. Jack nodded toward the rows of ships under construction. "Kaiser says we're building the ships that'll end the war." "Maybe we are," she replied quietly. "But it feels like we're building something else too. Something we can't stop." He didn't answer, and for a long while, they stood there in silence, listening to the hum of the yard. By the following spring, the tide of war had begun to shift. Allied forces were pushing back across Europe. The Liberty ships, Kaiser's fleet, had become the veins of the Allied effort, carrying food, fuel, tanks, and hope across the Atlantic. Losses were still heavy, but not like before. Every commander, every sailor, knew the name Kaiser. It had become synonymous with endurance. Washington sent a delegation to Richmond to honor the workers. The ceremony was grand, with brass bands, banners, and speeches. But for Evelyn and her crew, it felt hollow. They didn't need speeches, they needed rest. When Kaiser took the stage, he looked out at their faces and saw it plainly, the fatigue, the pride, the quiet despair. He set aside his prepared remarks. Instead, he said, when history looks back at this war, they'll count the ships, the tanks, the planes. But I'll count the hands that built them. Every rivet, every weld, every drop of sweat is a story. And those stories are what will outlast me, outlast all of us. It was the first time Evelyn had seen him falter. She realized then that even the man who'd built this empire was human, driven by faith, but haunted by what that faith demanded. After the ceremony, Kaiser withdrew from public view for several weeks. Rumors spread, illness, exhaustion, political battles. The truth was simpler, he was tired. He'd given every ounce of himself to the yards. And though the ships kept coming, he felt a strange emptiness. What happens when the race you've been running your whole life suddenly ends? The war concluded not with celebration, but with silence. The whistles stopped. The hammers rested. The fires went cold. Evelyn walked the yard one last time, the scent of oil and metal still clinging to the air. The empty dock stretched out before her, littered with the ghosts of 1,000 launches. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the ships she'd built were still sailing, carrying goods, bringing men home, ferrying the memory of those who hadn't returned. She found an old torch buried in the mud, its handle scorched and worn smooth by years of use. She held it for a moment, then placed it on a crate near the edge of the pier. It felt like a farewell, not just to the work, but to the version of herself forged in those fires. Kaiser returned to the yards for one final inspection that summer. The workers gathered quietly as he walked the line, shaking hands, exchanging words few could hear. When he reached Evelyn's crew, he stopped. "You were here from the beginning, weren't you?" he asked. She nodded. "We built the first, and we built the fastest." He smiled faintly. "And the strongest," he added. "Not just the ships." As he walked away, Evelyn looked toward the bay. The sun was setting, painting the water gold. The reflection of cranes and half-dismantled scaffolds shimmered like ghosts of giants. The war had ended, but its echo remained, in the steel, in their hearts, in the knowledge that what they'd done had changed the world forever. Years later, long after the shipyards had closed, the Robert E. Peary was decommissioned and sold for scrap. The world had moved on, building faster, stronger, sleeker vessels. But the spirit that built her, the audacity to challenge the impossible, remained embedded in every innovation that followed. Evelyn, now gray-haired and stooped, stood at a memorial overlooking the bay, where a bronze plaque read, "To those who built the ships that built victory." She traced the engraved letters with her fingers. Around her, the world was quieter now, no hammers, no engines, no thunder. Just the wind and the soft sound of waves against the dock. She closed her eyes and could still hear the hum of the yard, the chorus of voices, the crackle of torches. And in that fading symphony, she understood something that had eluded her all those years: speed had won the war, but sacrifice had won history. The Robert E. Peary may have been built in 4 days, but its true construction, the faith, the endurance, the unity, had taken lifetimes. And as long as those memories endured, the legacy of Richmond, of Kaiser, of every burned hand and sleepless night, would live on, not in steel, but in the unbreakable spirit of those who dared to outbuild time itself.